At this time, we will open up with proponent testimony and welcome back Representative Proctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee, again. We have a responsibility to stand with those who defend us, especially those that sacrificed and have been permanently injured and disabled by their service in service of us. And there's going to be a whole bunch of folks come up here who are going to talk way more eloquently than I can about that. And so I'm going to talk very briefly about the impact that this has on Kansas and the ways that this benefits Kansas. We have veterans leaving this state to go to other states because it's more favorable for disabled veterans, for tax structure, for some of these property tax incentives. Veterans homes, the body wisely voted last year to fund a veterans home for Northeast Kansas, which alleviates some of the problem, but we still have fewer veterans homes here than in any of the surrounding states. So for a number of reasons, we have disabled veterans, and most veterans that separate from the military end up having some level of disability, maybe not to the 30% or higher that would qualify for this, but they come out with injuries because it's difficult on your body and it's difficult on your soul. And the federal government recognizes that and continues to provide care. So my main reason for bringing this is to keep those folks in the state. And I've already talked about the out-migration problem here in Kansas. We want those folks staying here, not going across the river to Missouri because they've got better property tax breaks and they've got more veterans homes. So we want to keep them right here. I'd like to address a couple other things very briefly. First, there is already a property tax exemption for disabled veterans. It's part of the homestead property tax exemption that disabled veterans and people 65 and older are eligible for, but the income level is so low on it that very few people qualify for it. It's like 50,000. The committee wisely keyed it to inflation in the last session, but it's still going to take a really long time for it to grow. And as it's growing, people's income's growing. So I don't think that people are ever going to catch up and fall below that line. So there is this program, but hardly anybody is eligible for it. The other thing, just to clear up your question, so the 65 age limit actually allows more people into the program, right? Because you have to be 30% or more disabled to qualify, or 65 or older. So it's not a limit on the property tax exemption. It allows people when they become elderly, if they're not elderly, older, that if they qualify, if they're disabled at all, to qualify. But I want to finish by just saying, we want to keep these people in our state. Many of them, even though they're severely disabled, they can still work and contribute to our economy while they're here, and their families certainly can. They have great health insurance because the VA, anything that they can't get at the VA hospital, the VA sends them out on the economy to our doctors and our specialists, and it's paid for. So it's helping to fund our healthcare system here in Kansas. There's a lot of other employment incentives for companies to hire these folks, so they're highly employable. A lot of them have, advanced degrees. We want to keep these people in our state. And if all of those things weren't true, these are people that stood up, raised their hand, and sacrificed for their country. And we can't say that about every American, but we can say it about these Americans. And I don't know about you, but those are the folks that I want to be Kansans. With that, Mr. Chair, I will stand for questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members of the committee, for hearing this bill. I'm Representative Pat Proctor. I serve the people of Leavenworth and Fort Leavenworth. I'm going to defer some of the discussion of why our active Guard Reserve members deserve this tax break to some of our Guard members who are here today. They can speak to it much more eloquently. I've been out of uniform for a couple of years now, so I'm going to leave that to them. What I'd like to talk to you about is why this is good for Kansas. As I said, I represent Fort Leavenworth. After redistricting, I have the entirety of Fort Leavenworth in my district. There's about 10,000 people who live up there. Only about 1,000 of them are Kansas residents, give or take. Everybody else is a resident of another state. And it's not because they came from that state, it's because the tax environment is more friendly in those states. And so they get all their license plates in those states, they get their driver's license in those states. And when they leave the military, they're more likely to go to those states to retire because they've been a resident of those states their entire career. I want those folks to stay right here in Kansas, whether they're at Fort Leavenworth, Fort Riley, or McConnell. I want them to stay right here, and I want them to become Kansans. And the first step in having them do that is having them feel like Kansans when they're serving here. You know, they come to us with education paid for by the federal government. They come to us with unique skills. They're some of the most resilient people you'll meet. And their family members are educated as well. And they come with great health insurance when they separate from the military. And for all these, all these rural hospitals that are closing, having more well-insured Kansans is good for Kansas. But having more Kansans is good for Kansas because right now we're one of the top 5 states to move out of. And I want to reverse that trend. And so that's the main reason that I brought this bill to you. But another reason that I think that this is good for Kansas is because the U.S. military is good for Kansas. And I want to take just a minute to talk about the investment that the Department of Defense makes in the state of Kansas and how much money that is. We are number 30th in the nation, despite being one of the smaller populations. $3.7 billion is spent in this state as a result of having those military installations in our state. That's 1.9% of our gross domestic product comes from those military installations. It's about 1% of the total defense spending, which is disproportional for the size of the state. That's about $1,200 for every resident of the state that the Department of Defense is spending here because of these military installations. You might be asking, what's that have to do with tax bills? Well, I served 25 years in the Army. I know how the Army makes decisions, including decisions about where to put soldiers and where to put installations and where to put equipment. We're a very data-driven agency, the Department of Defense. I say we, I'm not in it anymore, but when I was in it, we were very data-driven. And I guarantee you that somewhere in the bowels of the Pentagon, there's a big spreadsheet with red and green bubbles for each state and the positives and negatives for putting military units, military installations in our state. And I guarantee you that we got a red gumball for charging military service members income tax, and Texas has a big bright green gumball for not charging income tax. And so this is just one of those ways, just like the House Bill 2066 that we heard a couple years ago to do reciprocity for licenses. This is just another way to make us more appealing to the Department of Defense so that they'll be bringing more service members and more units into our state and investing in our state. And I've already talked to you about the billions of dollars they invest. Every one of those dollars is increasing our gross domestic product and making us more prosperous. And so with that, Mr. Chair, I will stand for questions at the appropriate time.